I'm very pleased to say that we have convinced Kevin, or he's convinced us, to continue the series a little while longer. So we're going to look at, amongst other things, the Second World War, and was it a war to, free Europe and fight fascism, or was it about something else? We also want to put together a session on taking down statues, and Churchill in particular, the role Churchill played, and we're hoping to get at least one other speaker from one of the recent BLM protests on the role of history as well, and statues, what kind of history they represent, etc. And last not least, we want to look at a session on the lessons of Corbynism. So we're just looking at the moment at putting these together, and we'll put titles out as soon as possible. Okay, so this session today is about the general strike of 1926. It's a little bit out of chronology because we kind of thought of it while we were discussing other sessions. So probably, I presume we're also going to be looking at the role of general strikes in general, and what role they play in achieving social change. Kevin is shaking his head, maybe not. I'm sure that probably come up from in the discussion.
No, I was agreeing with you. Yeah.
Oh, you were agreeing. Okay, good. Good to know. We hadn't talked about this session beforehand, but I'm glad we're thinking about the same things, because it is a very popular slogan, isn't it? A very popular demand that supposedly sorts out things and can lead to social change, etc. Okay, Kevin, please, for 30 minutes. And then as usual, we'll open up for comments and questions. Thank you.
Okay, before I begin, comrades, just an apology. I'm having technical problems, so I can't see the screen very well. And I'm hoping that you can hear and see me. So I'm afraid it may have an impact on communications between you and me, but I must just apologize for that. Yes, Tina's right that this session really arose from a discussion, I think, that we had about the 1924 Labour government, and we talked a little bit about the general strike, and so it's really sort of an add-on, as it were. The other point that Tina makes, I think, is quite an important one, that the demand for a general strike is often raised on the left, and indeed it's often seen as a way of mobilizing people. It's often seen a way of galvanizing opposition around particular demand. And as such, it's seen as probably a very strong protest action, the maximum form of protest action that you could get. All organized workers come out on strike in support of usually an economic objective, but increasingly demands for political change as well. So I'm going to look at the one example of a general strike that we had in Britain in 1926, and I became very aware in preparing the session that we're fast approaching the 100 years in 2026, and in fact I looked back over some old books of mine, and those were books produced for the 50th anniversary. And I thought in some ways of how trying to talk about it to an audience nearly 100 years later, that some key aspects of the strike could be understood. Because when I taught this, when I first began teaching this in the late 70s, trade unions were much more powerful. Indeed, I remember teaching this topic in the midst of the so-called winter of discontent, which we've looked at in a couple of the other sessions. And so the idea of trade union power, sympathetic strikes, the nature of trade unionism to my students at that time was fairly axiomatic. In many ways, you didn't need to explain it. Now, I'm sure many comrades listening to this talk this evening will possibly remember that period, and certainly will have experience of trade unionism. But I wanted to try to locate the general strike in two ways. First of all, to talk about perhaps what it tells us about aspects of the labour movement, but also to look at the sort of political demands and indeed the ways that it's used. I suppose that those will really come up in the discussion, but I think some of these points will emerge as I'm going through. The actual details of the general strike, which occurred in May 1926, between the 3rd and the 12th of May, are in many ways fairly straightforward. There is a lot of complexity around negotiations and events, but there are, I think, some fairly clear and simple themes. The first issue is, of course, at the center of the general strike is the crisis in the coal industry, which in the early 20th century was still a major source of power. It's a very important industry, providing not only domestic fuel, but also the fuel to power industry, to power transport. And of course, large numbers of people worked in the mines. In the years before the First World War, probably about 1 million or so, and indeed still a significant number in the 1920s. So mining was a very important industry. It also, in some senses, and no pun intended, was a bedrock industry. And it was, I suppose, symptomatic of many of the problems of British capitalism, in that it was facing foreign competition from cheaper types of coal, particularly in Eastern Europe and East Germany, the so-called brown coal, which was available for some industrial processes. But I suppose the key question was the uneconomic nature of that industry. By that, I mean that the units were often very small, and above all, many of the coal owners, who have a reputation for being some of the most ruthless and rapacious capitalists in British history, had not invested in their industry. They preferred to reduce wages. In other words, rather than investing in machinery, they preferred to invest in human labor and then try and force that labor down, force the price of that labor down at the earliest opportunity. So the problems that British capitalism faced, really from the end of the 19th century, but certainly into the 20th and in the post-First World War period, are encapsulated in the situation facing the coal industry. So the key question was an attempt by the coal owners to reduce miners' wages, to do that in order to boost their profits, but also if wages couldn't be reduced, or indeed if wages could be reduced, this would then be implemented alongside increased hours. So the nature of mining as a very significant industry, also the degree of organization of miners, all I think made this a key industry. But I think there's another important theme here in the particular period that we're looking at, which of course is that these policies of attempting to cut wages, attempting to restore profitability on the backs of the working class, also were combined with attempts to reduce the power of organized labor. So government policies, and indeed the policies of the employers in general, were not just simply to cut wages, but to cut and to reduce the power of the working class to fight back against that. So this battle isn't just about the specific conditions of the mines. It's about, I think, a general policy of British capitalism in how it's going to try and deal with the working class, and above all deal with the power of the trade unions, which will obviously provide a barrier to those policies. The other theme I'd like to also draw on is the role of the leaders of the trade unions and of course the Labour Party in the form of J.H. Thomas and Ernest Bevin. You have people who are leading members of the Labour Party and also leading members of the unions. I suppose the way to think about it would be if Len McCluskey or Kevin Courtney or Dave Prentice or whoever was a leading Labour MP, as well as being the leader of a trade union. You get the idea of that sort of dual role in that way. And also to look at their strategy, and indeed what I think their handling of this crisis tells us about the nature of the the labour movement. And above all, a theme which I think has been very strong on the left, the issue of betrayal and the role of leaderships, particularly leaderships who, quote, sell us out. I think we're all familiar with the narrative that, and it's been a narrative that we've looked at in these talks, we're all familiar with this narrative of successful workers' movements being betrayed by leaders who compromise, or leaders who will, in a sense, back capitalism. So the handling of the general strike and the nature of that strike is also, I think, you know, a good case study to look at the nature of that betrayal and maybe to assess some of the reasons why it may have occurred, but also to look at the dynamics between leaders and the broader labour movement. We might also add as well the strategy of the ruling class. I don't intend to look at that in great detail because my main focus is on the labour movement. But you have in this strike two, I think, different facets of the ruling class. You have the Prime Minister, Baldwin, Stanley Baldwin, the man you can trust, safety first, the one nation Tory. And then you have the more hardline Tories of Winston Churchill and Austen Chamberlain, who want a much more aggressive approach towards the working class. So we see two facets of the British ruling class here, I think, the emollient face of Stanley Baldwin and the harder face of Winston Churchill. And then, as Tina says at the outset, I suppose the nature of the strike and the nature of a general strike and the potential that strike has for social change, for socialist change, and indeed how it sits in the strategic options open to the labour movement. Is it, for example, just merely a protest action, or is it, for example, a way of capturing state power, of indeed beginning the socialist transformation? And those sorts of debates, you know, began really in the 19th century with the origins of the socialist movement, and I think have continued up to the present day. So to sort of, you know, run through some of the key events, I've explained the background to the coal industry, and it was very clear that a battle was looming over the coal industry and indeed across wide areas of British industry in the 1920s. And what I think we can see emerging is a fairly careful strategy by the Conservatives and by the more far-seeing sections of the ruling class about how they would handle that. First of all, there's the question of preparation. The ruling class was quite prepared for the events that were coming, so that, for example, rather than go into a confrontation, they prepared the ground for the confrontation, and indeed, you know, made sure that it took place under the optimum conditions for them. So, for example, in July 1925, when the possibilities of cuts in miners' pay and so were indicated, coal owners were demanding these cuts. The government, under a degree of pressure from the TUC, conceded two things. First of all, they conceded a wage subsidy, in other words, that they would support miners' wages for a limited period. And then secondly, they conceded an inquiry, something like the 5th inquiry into the coal industry since 1918. And so you can see the sort of, you know, fairly clever tactics there. A movement and conflict around wage cuts is emerging. The coal owners are fairly determined. They represent a more militant section of the ruling class, and you know, they're slightly held back, or they're counseled to be slightly more cautious by the government. So the question is put off for the best part of the year. Now, alongside this period of I suppose, of preparation comes various attempts not only to drag out the negotiations or to have an inquiry that will make all sorts of recommendations, but the government also prepares for the possibilities of a wider strike, not just in the coal industry, but indeed other unions carrying out sympathetic action. And a number of initiatives are carried out. The one that's probably most well known is the attempt to recruit strike breakers, the so-called Organisation for the Maintenance of Supply. This is a sort of private organisation, but very quickly falls under government control. And this again shows their preparations, that that the government was both looking at this tactically, but also quite strategically as well. They were looking at how they might be able to defeat the strike should one take place. Now, what I think is a real contrast here is between the attitude of the government, which knows that it's in a battle, and that of the trade union movement and indeed the Labour Party leadership. While the government is preparing, the Labour Party leadership and the trade union leaders are attempting to negotiate. Now, you know, there's nothing wrong, I think, with negotiation and to demonstrate to your members that you've pursued every avenue. We're not arguing against that. But what I think is the way that this negotiation is carried out in the hope that something will arise, that from these negotiations, from these various reports, that some sort of solution can be found. Now, it's very clear that the mine owners will not make any concessions really on hours or on pay. So some sort of battle is going to be undertaken. The question really is, what's the nature of that battle and who's going to conduct it? Now, there's a fairly intense period of negotiation, particularly when the subsidy ends and it looks like that the wage cuts are going to be enforced. And seeing, I suppose, the significance of this, there's a tremendous pressure in the wider ranks of the labour movement that the movement as a whole stand behind the miners. And indeed, this pressure is really quite overwhelming. It often forces the TUC leaders into taking defensive actions, indeed backing the miners, possibly much more than they intended. But one thing that the TUC leaders were very determined on was that they would try to retain control of this. And so you have a very bureaucratic approach towards the conduct, both of the negotiations and then later with the strike itself. So that, for example, the TUC demands that in any negotiations, they have, in a sense, to speak for the miners. They speak for the working class as a whole. So the possibilities already of surrendering initiative to those sorts of leaders exist. And this, I think, will be one of the weaknesses of the campaign. Now, negotiations continue all the way up until the 2nd of May. And there are a whole series of events, again, comrades can read about them. But I think there's one telling sort of set of negotiations, one sort of telling set of elements. And this is that the TUC leaders are determined to try and find a solution, and they're constantly calling upon the government to negotiate, to mediate, to become involved. But the government has already, in a sense, set out its stall. And famously, the government breaks off negotiations on the eve of the strike, using as an excuse that print workers have refused to print an article attacking the strike. And the article is called "For King and Country," and it's a fairly hostile attack on the trade unions from the Daily Mail. So Baldwin says immediately that this is an attack upon the freedom of the press. But more importantly, and I think this is an important sort of political lesson for us, is that Baldwin clearly understands, not just as a political piece of political rhetoric, not just that it's handy to try and tar the labour movement with the brush of revolution with Bolshevism, But the very fact that this is not only a contest over working class living standards and whether the capitalists are going to be successful in their offensive, but also because this will be a real contestation for power, and that moving towards a general strike won't just be any ordinary strike. It will throw into very hard relief the question of who actually runs society. So Baldwin, for example, on the 3rd of May, just as the strike begins, really lays this out in very clear terms. He says that the government has found itself challenged with an alternative government, that the general strike is threatening the basis of ordered government and getting nearer to proclaiming civil war than we've been for centuries past. The strike leaders have created a machine which they cannot control. This is the moment which has been chosen to challenge the existing constitution of the country and substitute the reign of force for that which now exists. Now, what's interesting about that is that there was no such aim on the part of the TUC leaders. The TUC leaders were really trying to negotiate up to the last minute. But Baldwin doesn't only use that rhetoric, I think, as a way of trying to mobilize Tory voters and try to, use the usual arguments that when the unions are effective, they're threatening the constitution. Because in a sense, the general strike, as Rosa Luxemburg and indeed others who'd written on general strikes and had argued when they'd seen it as a strategy, had all argued that it was a contestation for power. So the government is quite correct. If the TUC does call a general strike and workers come out on strike and society does not run normally, then that poses not just an abstract question of power. It isn't just a sort of an abstraction. It's actually how will normal activities of civilized life continue? Which things will be allowed to operate, which things will not be allowed to operate? Who makes the decision? Now, if that's the working class, that in a sense is already establishing elements of working class rule, whether that be through bodies called strike committees or councils of action. So when Baldwin uses that language, it's rhetorical, but it's also fundamentally accurate, that a strike of this character does raise the question of the direction of society. Now, in response to Baldwin's comments, J.H. Thomas, the railwaymen's leader and also a leading Labour right-winger, says, "I have never disguised that this is a challenge to the Constitution. God help us unless the government win. That is my view, but this is not only a revolution, it is something that says we want it. Sorry, this is not only not a revolution, it is not something that says we want to overthrow everything. It is merely a plain economic industrial dispute where the workers say we want justice. It will be with no light heart that the fight will be entered into, because I feel in my bones that a last effort ought to be made. I still plead. The die may be cast, the fight may come. Do not let us have bitterness, whatever the immediate days may bring." So what I think is quite important here in Thomas's remarks is not only the absolute fear of revolution and the absolute horror in which the situation is found itself in, but for any strike leader to go into a strike and really pleading for the strike to be called off and acknowledging, in a sense, the rightness of the cause, I think shows some of the real limitations of this leadership. MacDonald, again in the same debate, says, "I respect the Constitution. With all this discussion of general strikes and Bolshevism and all that kind of thing, I have really nothing to do at all." And I think never a true word has been said. Now I've put a lot of stress here on the political rhetoric of individuals, and I think it is important to see that the Tory government had a fairly good appreciation of their opponents in the Labour leadership. So Baldwin, the Prime Minister, I said, cuts a rather emollient figure, or attempts to do that. he is aware that the trade union leaders are not only not revolutionary, but that they, that they're willing to pull back. But he also realizes that there has to be a significant defeat for the workers, but not a defeat that, for example, will be one that will maybe ensure further bitterness, that will deepen class polarizations. So his strategy is a defeat, but a defeat that he will allow to be conducted with the aid of the trade union leaders. So his strategy, which is one that's often being used, is to allow the union leaders a way out. He believes that the way to win is to give a decisive defeat, but that for that defeat to really be inflicted by the leaders, not through very harsh repression. He's quite willing to use repression should he need that. And indeed, in the strike, various emergency powers are used, arrests are carried out, the attempts to break the strike, use of the military and the police, and so on and so on. But his position, I think, is more subtle. Not that he is, conciliatory. He sees that the authority of the union leaders can in fact be used to police their own members, and above all, their own reluctance and their own unwillingness to really follow this strike through. Their essential belief in constitutionalism means that any strike of this character is going to be defeated really before it begins. In that way, he's very different from Churchill and from Chamberlain, who both favour a hard line. And indeed, given the reputation for the Conservatives as a far-sighted party of the British ruling class, I think we have to agree that Baldwin's line was probably the better one, because it was a correct estimation of the Labour leaders. Now, the strike began on the 3rd of May. It continued through to the 12th of May and was generally successful and solid. I won't go into details about the nature of that strike. I'm sure comrades can come in from the floor. A lot has been written of it in the standard accounts, but there are a couple of things that I will stress. The first one is that the rather sunny picture that emerges in many social history books, it certainly was the case in the 70s when the 50th anniversary was on, was of a rather sort of jolly British affair, good spring weather. The nearest we come to militancy was a rather hearty contest either on the cricket field or the football pitch of strikers versus police. You had the impression of a rather sort of subdued British affair that, unlike excitable continentals, we didn't go in for that sort of revolutionary stuff. But of course, that does rather belie the reality that I've described often of violent confrontations, and indeed of an attempt to break the strike in many ways. The other thing that it belies, I think, is something that was very apparent to the leaders of both the government and the trade unions and the Labour Party, was that the strike itself could very quickly develop a momentum and a dynamic of its own. And one of the interesting things is that we have some quite good contemporary evidence about the way that strike developed. The Labour Research Department, which was is an independent body of the Labour Party and had many active members of the Communist Party as its leading people, compiled questionnaires and asked activists in the aftermath of the strike what had gone on in their area. And the picture that emerges is of really quite effective strike organisation. Councils of action, which had originally been established to deal with the possibilities of war between the Lloyd George government and the new Soviet Republic, were developed as organs for running the strike, often based upon trades councils, in some areas on trades councils and Labour parties. And these organisations were very effective, indeed so effective that the strike was actually spreading when it was brought to an end on the 12th of May. So that as a demonstration of working class solidarity and of cohesion and support for the strike, it was, I think, really unrivaled. And the seriousness with which the government took the councils of action and the seriousness which they saw those organs of self-activity were, would be a tribute to that. This, I think, is where the debate about the strategy and about the place of the general strike and the specific political demands that are raised in relation to general strikes. It was very clear that the TUC leaders were actually afraid of the success, and very quickly they, behind the scenes, began to negotiate. They put out the feelers to the government. The government didn't respond directly. It used a number of intermediaries. And indeed, the return to work deal that was cobbled together was one that wasn't actually officially agreed with the government, and that the TUC leaders, in a sense, clutched at straws in order to get the strike called off. Now, that, I think, illustrates something of their fears and something of their particular position. Because if a strike of this character just automatically poses the question of power, then obviously people like the TUC and the Labour Party leadership do not enter into this type of movement lightly. Indeed, you might well argue that it's most unlikely that people who issue any sort of revolutionary rhetoric are going to want to, dabble in this sort of revolutionary phraseology. And indeed, the TUC spends most of its time saying that this is not a revolutionary struggle, it's simply an industrial dispute. But the questions that are posed here clearly go on much beyond that. I've referred already to the role of the councils of action in the localities. I've referred to the way that the state sees a challenge to its authority and its legitimacy. So where does the betrayal come in? Where does the reluctance of the TUC leaders and the Labour Party leaders to countenance this type of protest action? Well, I think it obviously comes in from something that I hope that we've seen throughout the course of these talks, which is their adherence to the Constitution and their adherence to the idea of legality, that anything that challenges lawful authority, anything that uses extra parliamentary power, is anathema to them. So, in a sense, the narrative that Baldwin comes up with about the revolutionary nature of this is one that the TUC leaders would themselves agree. And many of the comments by MacDonald and the TUC leaders already accept the arguments that Baldwin and the Tories put forward. So their own politics, have this limitation. Their own politics have this idea that anything other than a series of gradual social reforms cannot be tolerated. So any idea of developing socialism as a movement of self-organization, self-activity of the working class, the idea of challenging the capitalist state, that obviously is anathema to them. And their negotiation at the end of the strike illustrates that they were absolutely determined to call it off. Now, the problem, I think, for the left, and this was a problem that was recognized and discussed at the time, was how to orientate towards both a general strike and towards general strike movements. The general strike was defeated. There were a number of evidence of its defeat. The miners stayed out on strike into 1927 and then had to go back to work under fairly terrible conditions, very bad wage cuts, increasing of hours and so on. Other groups of workers also, when they returned to work, lost seniority rights, had wage cuts. There were a number of legal restrictions placed on trade unions by the 1927 Trade Union Act. So it was clearly a defeat. But I think I think that the discussions both in groups like the Communist Party, which was a relatively new group at that stage, and indeed amongst sections of the Labour left, were still unclear about what sort of orientation they should have had during that strike, and indeed how far the general strike should form a key part of the armoury. I referred back to Rosa Luxemburg and arguments historically about the use of the mass strike. Indeed, in France, in the late 19th century and also in North America, and of course in Britain before the First World War, the idea that industrial power, that the trade unions could in a sense be the motive force for socialism, the syndicalist movements, all of which tended to downplay the importance of a political party, of a social democratic party before 1914, or a communist party, or a Labour Party, or whatever. Those sorts of debates turn very much around, I think, the strategy for achieving socialism, and in particular whether a general strike, if it developed spontaneously, could then roll over into and become a socialist revolution, that from out of this strike an insurrectionary general strike could develop. And it's very clear that a general strike as a slogan, as a demand, does raise fundamentally the question of power. There used to be in the 1960s and 70s, and maybe into the 80s as well in Italy, there were a series of general strikes, and these general strikes often lasted for a day or for a half an hour. Indeed, famously, there were a sort of 2 and 3 minute general strikes, which in a sense were just protest actions. So the point about the general strike, Rosa Luxemburg understood this, in particular when she wrote about it, was that the strike does mean a contestation for power. The British ruling class understood that. I think the Labour leaders understood it as well, and they were clearly unwilling to pursue that. The question, though, for the left is, and this was the question debated at the time, what should their slogans have been? If the general strike does raise the question of power, then what sort of demands do you raise? Should it be, for example, all power to the councils of action, very similar to the demand for all power to the Soviets? Or should it be the idea of a workers' government, that the TUC become an alternative government in the way that the Tories had said they were aiming to do? So the general strike was both a tremendous demonstration of workers' power and self-organization and initiative, and above all combativity, a willingness to defend a group of workers and to defend the wider interests of the working class. But it does raise, I think, the question of the slogans and the demands of the strike, and it also raises the question of whether a general strike, with its implications of the contestation for power, should really be used just as a protest movement, or indeed a way of mobilizing, that in fact it should be looked at in a different light. And the experience of the British general strike, I think, shows the nature of our leaders. It shows the nature of that tradition of labourism and its attitude towards the Constitution. But it also shows, I think, some of the problems in strategy of just using a general strike as a more more amplified protest action, and not looking at the serious implications of power and our relationship to the state. So I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Kevin. Very interesting questions, I think, there, and somewhat would be useful if we can discuss them now. I have only one person who's indicated to speak, which is David. If you could switch on your video, please. And then other comrades, if you want to speak, please indicate, raise your hand, click the raise hand button. Don't just raise your hand because I can't see you. So if you want to ask questions or make contributions, please do so now. I think it's very interesting. Where'd you go from a general strike afterwards? I think that's a really good question. And how do you take that into challenging for power? Okay, Dave first.
Well, thank you for that. Once again, a really excellent talk, Kevin. So I'm really impressed by your breadth of your experience and knowledge, and let's have so much more of it. I really wanted to focus on the relative power that you sort of ascribed to the the press at the time, and the Daily Mail in particular. In as much clearly, I say, in those days the printed press was actually paramount in the way of communicating information from sort of the government and anybody else into the wider world, and really sort of by comparison, radio was say a few years old by that time, and TV had barely started, and social media was non-existent for quite some time. And therefore, I think what we'd like to discuss is really sort of how you think, this power of the printed press would actually play out today, in which the printed press is declining on a very rapid rate in the way its circulation is going, and therefore the dynamics of being able to communicate messages for and against such a thing, if it happened again, would be so much different. And there we, in my view, some scope for for counter activity, which probably wasn't there quite so much then as there would be now. So there was obviously papers like the Herald and the Daily Worker in there at the time, but would their reach be the same as what we would have from social media today, bearing in mind the printed press on the left is somewhat limited, there's only a few thousand copies of the Morning Star printed, and there's not very many other papers who would be actively sympathetic with a left-leaning approach to anything, really. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you, David. Keith is asking on the Q&A, as the union leaders obviously sold out their members, was there any reaction against them from within the union movement? Okay, next is Carmen, please.
Hi, I really enjoy talking about the general strike, and I believe if they have held on, they could have won, and then the leadership of the unions were afraid of the workers winning. And something that I find out personally is that there is not much records of the Council of Actions. It's like whatever minutes they were taking, whatever records they were keeping, is very difficult to get on to them. I'm talking about general strike. I am Spanish and I am Basque. And my father organized strikes in the late 60s and the early 70s in the Basque country during wildcat strikes, and they won. And perhaps they won because it wasn't a leadership. So you didn't know with whom to negotiate. It was very much submerged. It was very much focused on objectives. And it was, yes, of course, it was negotiation with employers, but it was very much standing, the line and standing solid. And it was done, factory by factory, workshop by workshop, and they won, right? So to me, it's clear that it was a betrayal from the unions, and very much the British unions still betray their own working class. It's very much about perpetuating their power, about perpetuating their positions. And we need them, but how do we reform them? That's the question. How do we reform the British trade unions?
Thank you, Carmen. Yes, that reminds the question. Pauline points out in the chat that the Daily Worker only came into being in 1930, but there was a weekly worker before that. Not really an organ that could rally on a day-to-day basis. Okay, Matthew.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Hi. Yeah, no, I thought it was a really good intro by Kevin. I think that, ultimately the general strike does illustrate a few things. I think, first of all, obviously a political question I mean, at this point, of course, the leading layers really are in the Communist Party, but the Communist Party in Britain is not particularly large by European standards, and is actually judged as, you know, in the common turn, commonly judged as the worst communist party in Europe, both because of its small membership and because of the political level of its members and leaders. And you can see, you know, obviously that as a serious, you know, disadvantage in terms of how, you know, how does it manage or not manage to exploit the position of general strike. I think the other thing, of course, is the whole question of in the British working class, which constantly recurs, is that the British working class itself tends to behave in sections. It tends to you know, we've seen it over and over again, that you know, bits of the British working class will fight, you know, with tremendous determination over prolonged periods in some cases. Obviously, the miners' strike of 84-5 is a key example, but the problem is it doesn't really behave and doesn't have a tradition of behaving as a class and treating these, you know, as in some countries where the working class actually sees itself as the working class and sees itself in these terms of taking on the ruling class. And you can see it, you know, particularly in somewhere like France, where that becomes, you know, it's commonly understood. You know, certainly among you know, the more political layers of the working class. So there's that. There's also the whole question, the problem for the ruling class of actually things like, you know, actually controlling the labour process. I mean, you know, the whole question in mining, of course, is that they really had great difficulty in controlling the labour process, and it was then, you know, the battle in terms of who controlled, you know, even the space itself underground. You know, and how that process was put together, and of course then, you know, as you say, the tremendous defeat of 26, which basically threw the organisation of miners back. You know, basically was then staging a whole long-term rearguard action to even reconstitute their own union against the scab operations of Spencerites. You know, essentially till the Second World War. So it moves everything, essentially throws everything backwards, and mining, the miners' union doesn't re-emerge until the late 60s and early 70s as a militant organisation. So I mean, you know, in those terms, it is a key, obviously a key event, but as you say, in terms of what lessons do people actually draw out of it?
Thank you, Matthew. I was going to ask just quickly, Kevin, if you could outline the debates in the CPGB a little bit more. That might be quite, if you know about it. And then secondly, also, I would imagine that once the economic crisis now really hits, and it will hit very soon with mass unemployment, etc., I think we will hear demands for a general strike quite a lot again. How we you know, as an organization on the left, how we should react to that in view. Do you think it's a useful demand, or when would it be a useful demand, perhaps? You know, is it linked to the working class having gained a particular strength for it to make sense to call for a demand like that? I'm calling in Mike now as the next person from the floor. Oh, sorry, Mike, can you switch on your camera, please?
Yeah, sure.
Cheers.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, hi Kevin. 3 issues. First of all, the relationship between Baldwin and Churchill in particular, because Churchill really was the hammer of the ruling class in this. And to what extent was he acting, in your view, was he acting independently of government, or was it a worked out strategy? Secondly, you referred to the short general strikes, so, you know, the 1 day, half day, etc. Now, obviously, these are not going to raise in themselves the issue of power, but to what extent can they act as a galvanizing force for raising the consciousness of the working class? And the third point, I'm just going to throw this out to a possible discussion in the future. is about the Arab Spring, and to what extent were the Arab working classes involved. I know there was a general strike in Alexandria, for example, in Egypt, and that was, I think, quite critical in the overthrow of the regime then at that point. So, but basically, I'm throwing out questions at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Okay, there's been quite a lot of questions and comments already, so I am bringing Kevin in now. Also, comrades, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please click raise hand, the little button. There's nobody else at the moment, or put the question in the Q&A, please, and then I can read it out.
Okay, thanks, Tina. I'll just reiterate that I'm afraid I can't see anybody's face, so my apologies if I'm looking rather strange. I'm looking at a completely blank screen at the moment, so at least I can hear you. I think there were some quite good questions, and indeed I think they should just form the basis of the rest of the discussion. The first question from Dave about the media and so on, I think it's an important one, because in many ways we've got tremendous potential with contemporary media. The fact that I'm I'm talking to people really across the country, and indeed I think probably in other countries this evening, and the way that the social media has operated in the last couple of months is an illustration of that. But I think perhaps the bigger question than the technology is maybe the importance of the media and communication and political discussion, and indeed developing what I might call an alternative culture. The other week we had a discussion on the German SPD, Rosa Luxemburg, and so on. And one of the things that was very important in the German SPD in the years leading up to the First World War, and indeed in many other socialist movements, was the party press, but also a whole range of magazines, and above all, a whole range of sort of cultural and other political activities. In other words, the idea of education and of raising consciousness was considered very important by the socialist movement throughout Europe. And although that took on different forms, it was considered to be very significant. And I think the task for all of us today is to try to recreate that. We can do that through newspapers and magazines, but we also, I think, need to do it in other ways. And I think it's probably one of the most important things that we can do to develop our politics is to develop that culture. There was I think it was Tina referred to the Workers' Weekly of the CPGB, but there was also another weekly paper, the Sunday Worker, that admittedly arose in the aftermath of this period, and that gained quite large-scale circulation. And there's some quite interesting articles by Lawrence Parker on that topic, which I think are available online. So the media was very powerful. Again, for up, I think, until the 1990s, the media was very important in shaping the political agenda in Britain. So I think from that point of view, we've got to try and emulate those traditions. And we've got probably now potentially more ways of doing it. And so I think in a way there can be a lot of optimism about the technology. We now just need to get on and create it. And this is what sessions like this are doing, I think, in a small way. Keith, your point about the reaction from the trade union members, well, in the immediate aftermath of the strike, more workers came out on strike and maintained the strike. In fact, there were more out on strike when it was technically over. But of course, workers did return to work. And I think this does, I suppose, raise questions of the consciousness of those workers. It raises the issue of how those workers saw the aims of the strike, how they saw their leaders. It built, for example, on the loyalty of many workers, and in particular the loyalty that they had to their organizations. I think anybody that's been involved in any strikes, as I have been in the last few years, as a member of that revolutionary vanguard, the University and Colleges Union, which I think now has got, you know, some sort of record for numbers of days lost in strikes. I'm very well aware that the way that the relationship of the more militant layers of the union towards their leaders, and a certain degree of trusting, but also a great deal of criticism. And so I think that I think that, you know, that's, you know, an important dynamic to consider when we're looking at how people reacted to the calling off of the strike. And indeed, it sort of makes the point about both the revolutionary potential that's inherent in a strike of this character, but also if it's not being prepared properly, then it will be, in a sense, using a very major weapon that is inevitably going to end in defeat. So I think both calling and organizing general strikes in that sense, you know, there has to be a degree of preparation and a very, very clear set of aims, so that the, you know, playing with insurrection and playing with our movement is not really the way that you know, a leadership should behave. In response to Carmen, you're right about primary material, Carmen. I think there are a few Council of Action minutes available in a few museums and archives in Britain, but the best source is a book by Emil Burns on the Councils of Action, and it summarizes questionnaires that were sent out to you know, to the Councils of Action. So we've got, I think, quite a good view. But you are right that unlike some other bodies, the records are a bit scanty. In fact, there is a real problem in writing the history of movements, you know, even in the recent past, that many of the records have disappeared. But we can trace it through newspapers, and indeed there are other sort of indicators of the nature of the strike. I actually remember the strike in the Basque Country, which I think was 1968, and then there were a series of other strikes. I seem to remember some in the shipyards in Bilbao as well. And again, I think that showed the, you know, the tremendous power of the working class, particularly in you know, in building up opposition to Franco in that period. And it was a very clear sign that the regime was starting to lose control in that way. What I think is interesting, and I can just about see some of your notes, I think, Carmen, that you put up, is that we have currently in the working class movement both many of the established unions, which have got a long history, but we've also got new formations as well. And those, I think, do bring in new layers. And I think we are seeing new layers becoming involved in you know, in many aspects of the service industries. So those may well point to some types of development. But I think the key question for those of us on the left is issues of basic union democracy, in particular democratic accountability, and above all, the ending of the idea of the trade union bureaucrats as a privileged group. So, for example, that they be answerable to the members, that they be elected, that they be recallable, and that their salary be that of a skilled worker in their particular industry. And those issues of democracy, I think, will become quite important, both in the unions and, of course, in the Labour Party more generally. I think, Matthew, you did ask quite an important point there, particularly about how people saw themselves as a class. And I think that one of the issues here is the contradictory nature of the general strike, which in its way was tremendously powerful, It was solid. It was very coherent, but the demands that it was mobilizing around were simply defensive demands. So that there was, I think, a consciousness of the working class, but not as a class in itself. Essentially, I think, as a class, very much the epitome of laborism, of defending its positions inside the existing system. And so, in a sense, you were using a very powerful weapon. You were pushing working class power for really quite limited aims. And the fact that you were in a sense using a revolutionary weapon shows both the pressure of the working class, because the trade union leaders who developed this, were from the left, and their election and their position, people like A.J. Cook, Arthur Purcell, and Hicks, and so on, people like this were a reflection of the strength of the left. But there was also a limitation in the broader consciousness, I think. So the more advanced sections of the working class could certainly be mobilized around the idea of the idea of the general strike, and indeed they could apply pressure on the left-wing leaders. They could even put the left-wing leaders into position. But that broader type of politics, that type of idea that this will be a struggle for power, was, I think, really very limited and confined to very small sections, which again is going to contribute to the defeat as well. So in a sense, the sort of idea of using this weapon as a protest form, and a weapon which is really a contesting power, I think does throw up this question of the strength of the left and the preparation that they've done for it. Tina, the debate inside the fairly young and small Communist Party was, I think, in some ways confused. And one of the things I'm always really loath to do, simply because, one, not only was I not there, but it's very easy, to coin a phrase, to use the enormous condescension of posterity and, tell these people where they went wrong and how we would have done it a lot better. Let's face it, our record in the last few years hasn't exactly, been anything to crow about. But I think that, I think again, there was confusion around the nature of the strike. I think there was confusion around whether there should be demands, for example, for what is in effect an insurrection, calling for all power to councils of action, which would then become the forms of government. So this, I suppose, then links in with the sort of debates which are going on in Western communist parties at this time about whether there should be a left government or a workers' government, the sort of arguments and debates which were going on in Germany. And I suppose, again, because of the German experience in Saxony and so on, of whether demand for a workers' government taking part in a coalition between communists and socialists, and how far you could use that as the basis for beginning an insurrection. These questions had all been debated, and I think British communists were trying to adapt to their own situation, of trying to adapt slogans from the Russian Revolution, of seeing the councils of action as potential Soviets, or indeed of centralizing the struggle on the General Council in that way. I think that the discussion around a general strike will, I think, grow, but I think, leaving aside any question about its nature, the practicality, or indeed the possibilities of mobilizing around that, will very much depend upon the strength and the confidence of the workers' movement. It's quite possible that in the impact of the post-COVID depression, we'll see high levels of unemployment, and indeed, although there will be, I think, combativity, and although I think there will be desire to defend conditions, I think that the demands may be raised, but I think that there may well be limitations on protest actions in that way. So I think that when the slogan is raised, and when it has been historically raised, for example, in Germany before 1914, it was often on the basis of high levels of employment and indeed of high levels of combativity and political consciousness. The possibilities of a general strike in Germany in 1914 on the suffrage question would, I think, almost have, raised the question of power, and we're not entirely clear about what the strategy would have been. But it's very clear that that type of situation is very different from the one that we're likely to go into. I think it links back to something that Matthew said, and it's probably about both the nature of the left and the need, I think, for an organized left, particularly a Marxist current in the labor movement, that is, fairly is conscious of a strategy, particularly of its goals and its aims, that simply a broad left, or even the strengthening of broad lefts, particularly in the trade unions or in the Labour Party, the trade union leaders and the left Labour MPs were immeasurably further to the left than their peers today, and even with those advantages, without a very clear, strong Marxist current, a Marxist party that could act as a channel, as a set of leadership, a way of generalizing that struggle, the leaders were still able to reassert their position. On Mike's point on Churchill, Churchill to a certain extent was something of a maverick figure, and on occasions he had to be reined in. I think that he was very much a figure that could be plausibly denied, that it was quite possible to deny that his more militant and anti-working class pronouncements represented government policy. The fact was, though, that he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, so he wasn't some sort of loony backbencher who was just shooting his mouth off. And the fact that he was running the government's newspaper, the British Gazette, and the fact that he did have authority does, I think, seem to suggest that he does represent another strand. But I would agree with you, Mike, that he does operate independently. That's both a personal characteristic of his, and also it shows again, I think, the way that different sections of the ruling class will play things. On the Arab Spring, I don't have enough knowledge of the details. I would say that I do recall that in Egypt in particular, but I think also in Tunisia, where there are some industrial works. I know certainly in Alexandria and Port Said and areas in the so-called Canal Zone, that groups of workers did take part in the movement, and that then gave this movement, a certain impetus. Again, I think if we think of aspects of the Arab Spring as being insurrectionary, and then I think we can see that this movement then does go from being a protest action to, in fact, a contestation, albeit one that's quite unconscious, or it doesn't have a clear leadership, a contestation for power. On the point about consciousness, I think, and the role of the general strike in that argument, I think, is one that's often made, and particularly, for example, about a 24-hour general strike, or the relationship between that and an unlimited general strike. I think protest strikes of this character can, have a, can operate in that way. I think, though, that it's when we deliberately use this in a sort of, I suppose, in a sense, pseudo-insurrectionary way. In other words, that we use the belief, or we emphasize that this is, the prelude to some sort of insurrectionary action, or we sort of play with that, perhaps more importantly, because what I think is clear from both the failure of this strike and indeed other strikes is if it has clear limited demands, and indeed is on the basis of rising confidence and of preparation and so on, then what is in effect a protest strike over wide sections of industry, you know, can achieve some immediate results and can then be the basis. But I still think that the political consciousness and the development of a general strategy that goes beyond the strike and looks at the nature of state power and indeed the aims of mobilizing the working class, that I think is the key function. The term general strike often, I think, is applied to often movements which don't deserve the title, you know, and they may in fact just be economic strikes, which then roll on into a number of areas. And I think, therefore, we have, if we're considering widespread strike action that really challenges both the employer's right to control the factories and the workplaces and the state to function, then that is clearly different from, say, a series of strikes around quite limited economic demands. But just to conclude, both Lenin and Trotsky, I think, in their analyses of the 1905 revolution and indeed the period leading up to 1917, looked at the nature of these strikes and looked at their character, their extent and their duration, looked at them very carefully in terms of looking at the sort of temperature of the working class and using it in relation to a political movement and a contestation for power. I think the syndicalist idea of a sort of spontaneous general strike that would spontaneously spill over into the seizure of power is a very different way of looking at the situation. Anyway, that's me for the minute.
Thank you, Kevin. I was actually, when you were talking about the SPD, I looked up again how many newspapers the SPD actually ran in the 1920s, and that is quite interesting. When it joined with the USPD, they brought their newspaper empires together, and they had over 200 daily newspapers in all of Germany. They had 200 people's bookshops. They ran 140 print shops. And they had 8,000 employees just producing newspapers for the SPD in the various locations, etc. And there were regional newspapers on top of that. That's certainly a different attitude to educating and mobilizing people than we had in Britain and have in Britain and European-wide now. The Die Linke, which is, you could argue, is a sort of, you know, the predecessor perhaps politically, etc. is, I mean, the SPD has no newspaper anymore at all. Die Linke, which is the far left, has a irregular sort of Daily Mail type, you know, tabloid, which is terrible. And of course, the Labour Party in Britain has also done nothing. I mean, Corbyn could have easily, or the Labour left, you know, could have easily set up a daily newspaper or a weekly one at least, or something, you know, social media, etc. We've made no use of that at all. It just occurred to me as a massive failure, one of the many that we've unfortunately experienced in the last few years. Okay, I'm bringing in Mark now. Hello, Mark.
How are you doing? All right.
Yeah.
Firstly, a couple of points. We had reference to the Daily Mail. I mean, it isn't just the Mail that was opposed to the strikers. Newspapers like the Daily Mirror have always taken the side of the ruling class. In the 1930s, the Daily Mirror printed lots of articles which supported fascism, and in 1926 they described the miners as a foreign foe. Today, in 1984, when Orgreave took place, the following days, one of the most vicious and right-wing attacks on the miners that took place was by the Daily Mirror. I thought the talk was really good and mirrored a lot of what I know from my own research into the general strike and some brief chats that I had with my grandfather back in the 1970s, who was on strike. They were both on strike at Easington Colliery in 1926, and actually for my sins I was dragged up in the only town in England named after a trade unionist just up the road, called Peter Lee, who was one of the leaders of the Durham mine workers in 1926. Durham was the most militant area actually in 1926. It had the least numbers of people. It had the most numbers of people that were actively involved in the industrial dispute. One thing I think which is important to note, and I'm not sure if Kevin mentioned, I didn't see the whole talk, so if I'm going over old ground, I must apologise, is that the TUC was quite popular amongst the working class at that particular period. It was a relatively new organisation, and in the north of England, and I didn't know this myself until Ian Dalton from the Socialist Party spoke to me 2 or 3 years ago about this, is it had won an important dispute in Yorkshire and Humberside for textile workers, and it was they coordinated that strike in essence. So there was a general feeling amongst some sections of the working class that they could win through the TUC's leadership, and that it was a matter of just coordinating the strike that would be particularly important. Finally, there were very few actual accounts of the general strike, certainly no leadership, or none of those that were in the forms of leadership ever wrote down anything significant. Bevan didn't, Cook didn't. So we don't have any accounts of the of exactly what was going on. The other thing we can say clearly is that the ruling class was getting its act together. The town I live in Halifax, I did a little booklet which looked at 3 strikes. One of them was the general strike, and it was quite clear, well, there wasn't any coal mines obviously in Halifax, is that the state was getting together large numbers of people who were going to support the state, and that was happening right across the country. The dispute, in my view, could not have been won because, in essence, the rank and file, not the broad left, would need to be organised sufficiently that it could take forward any industrial disputes, as has been the case historically in my lifetime. Some of the strikes that have been won have not been won by broad left politics, but have been like the Lang's lockout in the 80s, the strikes on the railways at the end of the 20th century, which got Steve Headley his job back. They were led by rank and file militants, or some of them, at least, before Steve became a full-time officer, of course. Finally, I have a little booklet out, which is on the general strike in the northeast Yorkshire and Humberside, sometime later this year. I don't think we would have much of a chance of pulling off a general strike in the current climate. I wish we had, but my optimism doesn't extend to that. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Okay, David has indicated to speak again. And then I think we have Kevin to sum up.
Yeah, so thanks so much again. So get 2 shots of this is quite good going. I say my really thoughts really about sort of how the government would actually be able to prosecute a general strike as much compared to sort of the 20s. Sort of the actual numbers of people who are actually employed by the state in the police and the armed services are actually quite low. And there's great use of sort of technology, and it's technology which is really aimed at a world war or a nuclear battle rather than something which is much more localized. And therefore, I think the government would have to rely on people to actually sort of, be motivated by them to be supporting it. So therefore, a victory for the left would really be about sort of how they sort of their motivation worked in the opposite direction. So you might think of some of the issues like sort of the environment, where sort of people would be sort of seeing that the righteousness of supporting the environment, and therefore there'd be some issue like that, which would mean that the left could hold the battle or win the battle of wills against sort of a government who simply wants to suppress their ability so to do. So I wonder if Kevin would like to comment on that a bit.
Thank you very much, David. I've got no more people indicating, and we're getting close to our finishing time anyway. So Kevin, if you could sum up for about 10 minutes. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks very much. And just a point to Mark, if you want to advertise it, I'm sure Tina would put it on a page or whatever, your booklet, which does sound very interesting.
Indeed. Have a webinar about it.
Even better, yes, yeah. And we're just really, I think I'll be quite brief in my summing up, because we've covered quite a lot of the points, I'd like to make. I think that the points that Mark made about the relationship of leaders and the rank and file, I think it is very important. Remember that many of the left leaders who had developed, who went on to the General Council, had themselves, I'm thinking of people like Cook in particular, were relatively recent trade union leaders. Whereas if we think of the right, like Thomas and Bevin, although Bevin, they were actually quite sort of establishment figures, and they were already in very highly bureaucratized unions. So I think the importance of new leaders, of the rank and file throwing up new leaders, is important. I think is always symptomatic of change, and indeed is what we on the left should be arguing for. But I think it also links into the experiences that the working class movement might have. I think particularly of the experiences of the sort of strikes that Mark mentions, in particular, not only the textile industry at the end of the 19th century, particularly in places like Bradford, but also that big strike wave which occurs before 1914. And in some ways that shows a great deal of working class combativity, it shows great potential, shows power, but it also, I think, shows, or it did for many people, tend to put focus on a very much a syndicalist approach towards politics. And that's where I think the industrial and the political sides of the movement come together. That one of the things that encouraged many workers after 1924 in the experience of the Labour government was an attempt to gain improvements and to defend their position through the use of trade unions. Just as with the defeat of the general strike and the Tory offensive, the Trade Union Act, 1927 and so on, there was then an attempt to move in towards political action and the election of a Labour government in 29. So I think that the two wings of the movement are very important. And one of the problems, I think, of the move before 1914 was very much a tendency of among some people, not just on the right, but for some on the left as well, was to divorce themselves from specifically a political program and indeed the need for a political party. And that was sometimes born from hostility towards the nascent Labour Party, and often many militants believed that their trade union action, their militancy was all that was needed for both to gain immediate demands, but also in terms of constructing a socialist consciousness that could create a socialist society. Again, I think what was interesting to me in the 1970s, when many people were discussing this, was that those ideas are often quite strong, and particularly amongst far left groups, that industrial militancy and the consciousness of industrial workers would be the way forward. And I think that the general strike shows some of the limitations of that. David, in your last points, I'm afraid that I didn't hear everything that you said, so I can really only just get the main sense. But I think you raised an important point. In a way, your earlier point about newspapers and about the battle for hearts and minds is, I think, linked into something else about the nature of the state. States don't only rest upon armed bodies of men. In the final analysis, they certainly do. The state will use the army, the police, and all sorts of other resources to deal with the opposition. But the fact is that in normal times, for much of the time, the state rests upon a degree of at least acquiescence, if not consent. And much of what a state attempts to do, and this is what Baldwin, for example, was attempting to do, was to undermine the legitimacy of the opponents of the state, to strengthen his own authority and legitimacy, and to build consent. So that struggle between consent and coercion in the repertoire, almost, if you will, Churchill on one hand, the armed body of men, and then Baldwin, the emollient figure, is trying to build consent. I think what we as socialists are attempting to do is to undermine that consent, not only the consent towards the state, but the consent towards capitalism. We're trying to build a socialist consciousness. So newspapers, webinars are all part of that. Small activities like this, but bigger activities, both of political campaigns and indeed of the wider raising of consciousness. These are all part of a battle of wills and a battle of ideas. Before the working class can challenge the state and can challenge capitalism, it has to have, I think, that degree of consciousness. It has to be conscious of its own power as a class. But above all, if it's going for a contestation for power, it has to have very clear aims, not just a set of protest actions, not just a set of defensive actions, but actually to move and consciously take command of the situation. Because what the general strike shows in Britain, as indeed elsewhere, is the tremendous power of the working class, the tremendous potential that the mass of the population have in running society. What we now need to do is to turn that into a conscious political movement, a political consciousness which is, not only clear on its aims, but is also determined in achieving them. And so I see, the sort of work that we're doing here as part of that process. That's all.
Thank you very much, Kevin. You summed it up. You managed to sum these things up so nicely, like it's your job or something. Quite right. Our job is to undermine the consent to the state and capitalism, and also to develop, I guess, an idea about where we're going and what we're fighting for, and what socialism is, etc. This is all part of what we're doing, indeed. As I said, we will update the description of these series ASAP. There's going to be 3 more sessions. Next week is going to, Kevin, I'm not sure if he's got a week off. I think he's actually chairing a session next week, which is organized by Merseyside Labour Left Alliance on Thursday on Black Lives Matter, is the Labour Party institutionally racist? We're also doing a session tomorrow, if anybody's interested, on Zoom training. If comrades are interested in organizing sessions on Zoom and don't quite know how it works, send an email, please, to zoom@labourleft.org, and we'll send you the links on how to do that. And next Tuesday, we have a session on the Soviet Union, which follows up from one of our previous webinars on looking at what happened after the Russian Revolution. That session on Tuesday will be about what led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in the final end. So thanks very much for joining us tonight, and I'll see you hopefully soon, Tuesday, Thursday.